question has to do with national security, and I won't read the question per se, but well, we are having a debate here about foreign investment in sensitive industries, and we seem to be more inclined to regulate this than most other countries, with the possible exception of France, which uses it as an excuse for protectionism. But to what extent do you, Gary, or any of the others feel this is a problem for us, or do the other countries have a better and more flexible way of doing it, or they just ignore it?
This is the real face of protection in the United States. On the trade area, it's still talk. In investment, it's action. And the next action is going to be airlines, because the new head of the Transportation Committee in the House feels that any foreign investment in U.S. airlines is a threat to national security. Our airline civil aviation industry has dropped well behind in terms of international competitiveness. The Bush administration had some proposals which would allow more foreign investment. That will go the way of Dubai ports if it comes forward. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. We are going to be going down this road at least for the next couple of years.
Can I ask you that question about competitive? You said our airlines have gone down in terms of competitiveness. Certainly any of us who travel on them understand that in terms of service, but are you referring to anything other than service?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, right. Well, the service may be lousy, but you look at the networks which Lufthansa, British Airways, and Air France is actually doing better than some of our airlines. They're building global networks. Our firms are pretty well confined. We have a kind of a fragmentation model, and of course, you know, the financial results. We do not have a single airline, even including Southwest, in the top 20 in profitability in the world. You look at the new orders for aircraft; they are not going. U.S. firms are not ordering aircraft. It's just, you know, it is, but I don't think it's appreciated what we've done and how we're cutting out investment and so forth. That is pushing this industry down globally.
Well, thank you all very much, and we'll turn it back over to you.
We now have a chance for what we always bill as coffee and conversation. And if you could go out through the ante room and right on into the boardroom. We've set it up there. There should be lots of room to circulate and continue this conversation. And don't forget to email Steve Pearlstein every time you see the word competitive. Thank you very much. That was
Hi, good to see you.
You suggest
John Cranford is certainly now the senior editor. Is that right, John? National editor of Congressional Quarterly. Has done played a number of roles in the world of journalism, but actually spent much of his time earlier in the 1980s at CQ, where he really covered this whole question of trade, competition, industrial policy, and so forth in meticulous detail. If you're doing research in this area and you want to see what Washington was thinking and doing in the 1980s, you cannot do it without repeatedly tripping across the name John Cranford with one interesting article after another. John, let me turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Kent. As he said, we went through the wars together 20 years ago on some of these issues, and I suppose some of you in this room have been talking about competitiveness for the entire 20 years. I sort of dodged away from it for a while, and I'm glad to see it's back because I like to see history repeating itself. I'm going to be real short here. There are bios of all of these panelists in your packets, but I'm going to introduce them briefly. To my right is Carl Dahlman. He's a Henry Luce Professor of International Relations and in Information Technology at Georgetown's Foreign Service School. He focuses on advances in science, technology, information, and how they affect economic growth and influence the increasingly globalized world. Before Georgetown, Professor Dahlman had more than 25 years at the World Bank. To his right is T.N. Srinivasan. He's Samuel C. Park Jr. Professor of Economics at Yale. He's taught previously at the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi and at numerous U.S. universities. His research interests focus on trade, agricultural economics, and microeconomic theory. And at the far end of the table is Brian Ritchie. He's an associate professor of international relations at the James Madison College at Michigan State University. His research and teaching focuses on the political economy of development, especially for Southeast Asia. He has particular expertise in innovation, technological development, skills education, training, and social capital. We're going to start with Professor Dahlman, who's going to talk to us some about China, followed by Tien, who will talk to us about India, and Brian will conclude with discussion of Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and other parts of Southeast Asia.
Need some help to get over to the desktop. Just get some of the desktops. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for a little technical glitch. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to go very quickly through my presentation. I'm going to cover quite a few things. I have 9 minutes, so it's a bit of a race. Just to put it in a perspective, here I have the shares of different parts of the world. The US is the gray line, the expanded European Union is the red line on top. The red line that goes diagonally up, that's East Asia, which includes, of course, China. And here is a projection. All this is looking at the size of the countries in terms of purchasing power parity. And here's a projection based on the growth rate for the last 12 years, where they might be in the near future. Right now, China is the second largest economy in purchasing power parity terms, projecting at the rate that's been growing in the past in other countries. It'll be as big as the US by about 2011. And this was before the adjustment in the per capita incomes, the GDP in China as a result of the revaluation in 2005 when they realized there was more of a private sector than they thought, especially in services. But the other interesting thing, and this is also about the next presentation on India, India is currently the fourth largest economy in PPP terms, and it'll become bigger than the third largest, which is Japan, by the end of next year in PPP terms. So we're talking about two very big economies if you measure them in terms of PPP. Now, in terms of real dollars, this is merchandise exports. China is now the third largest exporter of merchandise goods in the world. And if you project at the rate they've been growing for the last 5 years, they're going to be bigger than the US by the end of next year and catch up to Germany by about 2009. Now, big caution. You can't project based on historical trends. This is just thought experiments of where they're going. Things likely change and we're often wrong. So this is just to sort of show the growing importance, the economic significance of these large economies. Now, China has been investing a lot in education. It used to have an enrollment rate of 6.5% in 1997. Now it's up to 21%. So as of last year, it has the largest tertiary education system in the world. It's larger than the US, and 40% of them are in math and science. The quality is still low, but they're investing very quickly. On the R&D side, they've also been ramping up. Here on the horizontal is R&D as a share of GDP. The vertical sciences and engineers per million population. The size of the circles is the absolute money. Again, in PPP terms, the US is the biggest, followed by Japan. But China has been ramping up on the R&D part too, and it was about 0.8% of GDP in '98. Last year it was 1.4% of GDP. If you do some quick calculations, probably by the end of this year, they'll be spending as much as Japan in PPP terms. Now, it's not yet very efficient. This is indicative of where they're going. And the key thing is China has been very effective at tapping into global knowledge through trade, copying, reverse engineering, through foreign investment. And now it's beginning to invest on its own account. Still quite inefficient, but improving very quickly. So it will be more competition from that side. So the strengths of China are the very large market, very large growth it has had, savings rate of about 42% of GDP. That makes a big difference, although it may not be so efficiently invested. It's been really good, as I said, at tapping into global knowledge, including, what I said before, also the Chinese diaspora. It's becoming the world's manufacturing base. It's very integrated into the world economy. Of the large economies, it has the greater structural integration in terms of imports and exports. It still has a large supply of excess labor, in which it can bring on stream about 200 million people in the rural sector, so wages can continue to be low for a long time. It's moving up the value chain very rapidly because it's being able to do a lot on its own, plus all that it gets from tapping global knowledge. It's very efficient on export trade logistics. Almost any of the Chinese ports can place merchandise in the U.S. Much more cheaply than even Mexico. And it's also doing a lot on the R&D side, as I said, strong Western education, and a government with a big sense of national purpose, and we can save that for the discussions. But it also has big challenges. It's got the increasing income inequality, very limited natural resources, big environmental, negative environmental impact. It's also very dependent on the global market. If there's a protectionist turn, it's going to be in significant trouble because it depends so much on the global markets. It's a very weak financial sector. There's also a tension between the transition to a decentralized economic system and a one-party system. Now, it's the speed, scale, and scope of China's rise to the international system is unprecedented in history. Its trade expansion has not been the fastest, but it goes from a bigger base, so the impact it's having on the world is much bigger. And as I said before, it has done this by plugging into the global system very effectively. It's got tremendous economies of scale and specialization. It's adopting all kinds of new elements of competition, education, the innovation, also the ICT use, and tremendous improvements in connecting to the global system. Now, very quickly in terms of impacts on the U.S., on the positives, on the, oops, I got this out of sequence here. On the plus side, U.S. consumers are benefiting from the reduction in cost of manufactured products. That's helped to keep the inflation down, and also the Chinese are purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds that keeps the interest rates down. The companies competing with the Chinese imports are feeling some of the increased competition, but if they relocate to China, that allows them to remain competitive globally. There's a lot of potential to sell to China. And the U.S. is benefiting perhaps more than most other countries because it's the most dynamic and able to adjust and move up the value chain and innovate because it's got the most flexible system. I think Europe is going to have a lot more trouble. Let me just back up now to the far slide. On the negative side, there's lots of regions with a lot of concentration of industry which are going to be hurting, and as China continues to expand not just in labor-intensive goods but medium manufacturing. The U.S. manufacturing workers will face a lot of pressure from the low Chinese wages and the increasing productivity. Knowledge workers, so it's not just investment in education, will also feel a lot of challenge, and not just from China but also India, because now we have tremendous possibilities for doing things through internet. Anything that can be digitized can be offshored. And the friction with China is going to increase over the exchange rate, intellectual property, access to natural resources, energy in particular, and of course geopolitical influence. Now, in terms of the bigger global picture, part of what is going on for the U.S. is countries are catching up in terms of the relative R&D effort in education and ICT infrastructure. Also, multinational companies are also coming from Europe and Asia now. There's a bit of confusion now on who is us in terms of the multinationals, since you have stock ownership from all over the world. Countries are grouping into regional arrangements, and that's to compete with a very large U.S. market, although now because of trade liberalization that's less important. The U.S. is very vulnerable with a very large fiscal and trade imbalance, and is neglecting the necessary flexibility in the infrastructure to redeploy assets to the more competitive use and also its economic leadership. And I think there's also going to be a growing tension between the growth and the strength of global multinationals, which are operating for the profit function of the stockholders, which is perfectly appropriate, but their interests may be very different than those of the workers in particular economies, and that's something that should be looked at more. In the big picture, what's happening is two major components to a lot of global restructuring. One was the unbundling of things that could be produced, factories going offshore, but now we have unbundling of tasks because of what can be done through the ICT. So the implications of this is that the returns to labor in developed countries are decreasing, and because of the doubling of the global labor force, Richard Freeman at Harvard has estimated that with the entrance of the new emerging countries, China, India, former Soviet states, the total global labor force in globalization is twice as big as it was before. So the returns to capital are increasing, you have more labor, the job security is decreasing, and then you have this tension between the big agent of globalization, the multinationals, and the domestic economies. Some of the implications for the U.S. is the need to increase the flexibility of the economy to constantly restructure, not just to the shocks, reducing the fiscal and trade imbalances, increasing the innovation effort. And then on the whole education part, I think education is fundamental, it gives flexibility, but what has happened is that higher education and knowledge workers are not protected in this new, more dynamic world environment where we have this new element of the potential to do many things at a distance. So lots of skilled people, especially in the ICT sector, now you can do it much more cheaply in India or in Philippines or in China or former Soviet states. This also implies then it's very important to focus on strengthening the social safety nets, which are very weak here. That's unemployment, job retraining, health insurance. And that's going to be a big issue. It was already brought up this morning in terms of increasing inequality. The U.S. has to improve also its global image. It's made a lot of enemies and drawn a lot of fire, and that's going to be a big problem in terms of its geopolitical position. And on China, in spite of all the competition that's coming, China needs to be considered as a partner in this very unstable world because it has a lot at stake in the global system. So I'll just leave it at that and we can go into questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to make a presentation at this important meeting. Now, my presentation on India will complement what Carl just said about China. One way of thinking about it is to realize that China opened up its economy in 1978. India became serious about opening the economy in 1991. So if you run the clock forward, but recognizing that there is a 10-year, 12-year lag between India and China, you get a very similar picture for India. Now, I'll have just three sections to my presentation: introduction, global integration, strengths and weaknesses in meeting challenges. Now, India ignored comparative advantage altogether for first 30 years of its development. It was a Soviet-style, inward-oriented, state-directed development strategy, almost from 1950 to 1991. In the mid-1980s, it started with some hesitant and piecemeal reforms, but that was coupled with, until 1980, the macroeconomic policy was very conservative. Indeed, we had the stability, what I call stability of the graveyard. You have huge micro distortions and macroeconomic stability. It didn't deliver growth, but we had stability. But in the 1980s, the macroeconomic stability was given up, fiscal profligacy, increasing fiscal deficits, financed by domestic and external borrowing, that generated growth. Growth accelerated, but this debt-led Latin-style acceleration and growth could not be sustained, and when the first Gulf War came, the macroeconomic crisis emerged. Now, after the macroeconomic crisis, as in all macroeconomic crises, India goes back to the institutions on the 19th Street, and the 19th Street institutions suggest conditionalities for assistance, but this time, 1966 also, India had a similar crisis and went to the same institutions and the same conditionalities were imposed. But at that time, India followed the conditionality for 2 years and then of liberalization, opening up, etc., and gave it all up in 2 years. This time, India did not, and it introduced systemic reforms, abolition of investment and import licensing, unified and largely market-determined exchange rates, reforms of debt management, telecommunications, financial sector, you name it, across the board, reforms were introduced. In my view, this time why systemic reforms not going back to business as usual was that one of the reasons was the mentor for India in economics, the Soviet Union, had collapsed. And the second, China's enemy in international relations with China, India had fought a border war in 1962 and lost. And so China's rapidly growing after 1978 was visible to the Indians. So this time there is no going back to the old business as usual. And so the liberalization did let me here we go. Carl has already mentioned the relative size of China and India compared to the rest of the world in the national income as measured by Atlas exchange rates of the World Bank. India is the 10th largest economy, China is the 4th. In terms of PPP, India is the 4th and China is the 2nd. And the share of world income in terms of PPP, China is the 14.2% or 1/7 of the world economy. India is 1/16, about 6%. And per capita income differences you see here as well. China is about twice as rich as India. Now, the China-India comparison goes way back. Now, if you look at the first, I'm looking at the numbers put together by Angus Madison, the economic historian. If you go back to the first wave of globalization in the late 19th century until the First World War, India did very well and China didn't do so at all. And that situation pretty much continued after that during the interwar period. And basically at 1947 India became independent. 1949 the communists took over. By that, India had about 25% advantage over China in per capita income. The entire Mao period was essentially spent by China in catching up with India. So the divergence between India and China is entirely a post-1978 opening up of China phenomenon. And China, of course, has done very well. In terms of growth of real GDP, you see the comparison, the first 30 years, neither economy did too well. The Indian economy had 3.25% rate of growth on an average per year. That is the so-called Hindu rate of growth, which is very low. Then the 80s growth accelerated, 90s maintained. Now the latest quarter, first quarter of 2006-67, Indian economy is estimated to grow at 9%, and the Chinese at 10.4%. So the India-China gap in the growth rate is diminishing. Now, most important statistic is the poverty data in both economies. Until they began opening up and the economies began growing faster, there was no dent in poverty at all. In the Indian case, until 1980s or so, early 80s, the poverty was about 50% of the population. Now it is 22%. So once again, in terms of growth, the economy has the growth has delivered. It's what one expects growth to deliver. Now, India, as I said, lagged behind China by 10 years, and that you see in almost every indicators of in measure of global integration. One broad measure, if you take share in global exports, this is 2004, not 2005, India is 0.8% and China is, India is 0.8%, China is 6.5%. India's rank is 30th in the world trade as China's is 3rd, and India is going backward in that in terms of ranking. Services India does better, as you would expect, based on information technology, etc. Still, relative to China, still the share is only 1.9%. In the long-term trends, also, India, through its first 30 years of ignoring comparative advantage and being inward-oriented, brought its share in world exports from 2% in 1948 assiduously down to 0.5%. Since its opening, it has slowly increased to 0.8%, but whereas China has made a substantial jump. Once again, in terms of share of trade in GDP, you see 64% for China, 28% for India, a gap. Foreign capital inflows, India 5.3 billion in 2004 against 55 billion in China. Protection levels. Still, India is one of the most protected countries in the world among the developing countries. And 92% of the shares, tariff lines, have tariffs which compare to international peaks. Now, weighted mean tariff in China is 28% as contrasted to 6% in China. Now, once again, so the gap between China and India in this matter is very clear. Oh, it went. Now, what I wanted to, the last slide, if I can, there we go. No, it doesn't work. No, it doesn't work. The last slide, I went through the challenges India faces. Now, the emergence of information technology industries was in many ways an accident. In part, India had set up long ago in the 50s for institutions of excellence in engineering education, like Indian Institutes of Technology. For a long time, it didn't bear any fruit because the economy was essentially closed. Now, once the economy opened up and the opening towards made its way, India, the information technology industries made a big change. Now, whether this can be said, and India missed what China did in expanding labor-intensive manufacturers. That India missed altogether. Now, India's share, services share in India's GDP is about 60% now, which is much too high for the economy of India's per capita income. Now, India has, compared to China, the vibrant representative democracy is a great strength. China is nowhere near India, and whether it can transform itself into a democracy is an open question. India has an independent judiciary and well-functioning, though slow, system. You can put it back there. I'm sorry. Leave it there. Leave it right there. Now, financial system in India has improved tremendously compared to China. Again, the financial system is far more resilient, far stronger, far fewer non-performing loans, and the regulatory system is also very good, though not as good as in the United Kingdom, where you have a unified single financial sector regulatory authority. India is like the United States. It is divided among several authorities. Indian enterprises are becoming global. They are acquiring right, left, and center all around the world. But Indian physical infrastructure and human infrastructure is bad compared to China. In particular, electricity, roads, ports, airports, a lot to be desired. Education system is large but poor quality, except for a thin crust at the upper end. And whether the system could be changed rapidly enough to sustain the growth that we are experiencing in the last 2.5 decades is an open question. The governance problems, corruption. China is also very corrupt, but compared to China, the nature of the corruption problem seems to be far more serious, even though quantitatively it's not as large as one sees estimates from China. As far as challenges to the United States is concerned, I think since US and China are the large democracies, and they understand the constraints each face from the political system and respond to that. I think the challenges posed by India would be much better addressed by the US than it is likely to be the case with respect to China. As far as the global system, I don't have much to add to what Carl has already said. I'll stop there.
Brian?
I'm very pleased to be with you today. I realize that the time is already gone, and so I will try to do this as quickly as I can so that you'll have a chance to ask some questions. I'm going to actually talk about some countries that are very different than the countries that have been talked about so far. I'm going to talk about some very small countries economically that probably nobody has perceived as being any kind of threat to the United States. I don't remember reading anything about people being worried about Thailand overtaking the U.S. anytime soon. But I think that there might be something that we can learn from these economies that might be interesting. So I'd just like to go through a little bit here about Southeast Asian development strategy, kind of what a little bit of history and then a little bit of strategy. Southeast Asia really were the countries that for a long time people thought of this flying geese analogy, that they were following Japan and Taiwan and Korea. And it turns out that that analogy doesn't really work very well for a number of reasons. There were a lot of changes in the global system that made it virtually impossible for these countries to implement the same kind of industrial policy, the same kind of protection. There was not the same market access in the United States, and so these countries were forced to adopt very different strategies. At first they tried the import substitution route, but being very small economies, the markets really didn't support that. However, at the Plaza Accords in 1985, when the U.S. forced the Japanese to restructure their exchange rate, there was a massive shift of capital out of Japan and into Southeast Asia, probably for contiguous reasons primarily, but also a pretty well-educated labor force and low-wage labor as well for manufacturing. The U.S. and Europe followed fairly rapidly, and there was a massive influx of FDI into these economies. They rapidly shifted to focus on open markets. You can kind of see, and certainly the ASEAN countries were doing this long before China was. If you put the ASEAN 4, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand together, you can see that they're approaching 300 million in total FDI inflows over the last 30 or so years. And you can see that and compare that with China, which has certainly eclipsed and passed them, but still there's this significant amount of FDI that has flown into this, or gone into this region. The results have been very impressive. These countries together have averaged better than 6% GDP growth per year, and that includes the years over the financial crisis. By the late 90s, many of these economies, in fact, all of these economies had better than 40% of their exports were made up of high-tech exports. And in the case of Singapore and Malaysia, those numbers are 70, 80, and approaching 90%. Thailand has become known as the Detroit of Asia. Just to give you an example, all of Ford's production for the rest of the world outside the United States happens in Thailand. Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand produce the large majority of the hard disk drives that are in your computers. The media, they also do a large amount of manufacturing of computer chips. However, it's clear that by the mid-1990s, there's a diverging, actually it probably even begins earlier than that, maybe the early 90s, a diverging in technological capacity. And one of the things that has become pretty apparent is that oftentimes, and especially from an economic perspective, we equate technological deepening and upgrading with growth. And in fact, those things are two very different things. And it's clear that Singapore diverges from Malaysia and Thailand in terms of this technological capacity. So just to give you an idea, from a similar base in 1970, R&D as a percent of GDP now, Singapore invests a percentage that's very similar to the developing countries, about 2%. Malaysia and Thailand are still struggling down in the, as early as 1996, the 2.22 level, and now up to about a little over half of 1%. Researchers per million capita are a similar thing here. You have the Singaporeans who, again, are closer to the developed countries, and Malaysia and Thailand still struggling to up the number of scientists and engineers. I think and I think this is where we can learn something. The difference between these economies is the approach that Singapore took. Being forced to play in a global economy, they were very much about opening the economy, but at the same time, they realized that they needed to take a techno-nationalist approach to creating intellectual capacity, to creating knowledge, to creating innovation. And what I've kind of termed this as a coordinative type of state relationship, where they were trying to leverage technology from the foreign firms and make it their own. This has resulted in where the state is creating these coordinative linkages between firms, government agencies and departments, organized labor, and academia. And as I mentioned, again, it's the focus on improving this national technological capacity. And it's resulted in a very interesting outcome. It's different from, say, Ireland, where if you have Microsoft or some other company that takes its R&D facility to Ireland, but the R&D capacity and technology and intellectual property is still owned by Microsoft. In this case, Singapore has actually created the mechanisms to move that technology out of Microsoft and into the local economy. And they've done this in a number of ways, and perhaps I can get into this more during question and answer. But they've actually they've created incentives for these global firms, these multinational companies, to help create industry within Singapore. And for example, one of the industries they've done very well in is precision engineering. And precision engineering in a very unique area, but one that's applicable across a number of industries. I can just tell you a really quick story. Early on, they were trying to get industries to come to Singapore, and one of the companies that they contacted was a German company named Rollei, which was an optics manufacturer. And Rollei said, well, we'd love to come to Singapore, but you don't really have the engineers that we need. And the Singapore governor said, I'll tell you what, if you will come and train twice as many engineers that you need, then we'll pay for it all. But the deal is that when you're done, we get the extra half, the half, again, the number of engineers. So Rollei agreed. The Singapore government paid for the training. The extra engineers were then taken and put into the Institute for Technical Education system. And they just started cranking out these precision engineers for optical capacity. Then they went out to other companies and said, hey, we have a bunch of precision engineers that can do optics. Are you interested? And then companies like Seagate, IBM, Maxtor, Hitachi, all of these companies came because it turned out that these precision engineers in optics were very good for hard disk drives. And now they've replicated this in a number of ways, and they continue to do this over and over again, but it's about moving the technology out of the firms and into the country. And there's a number of, that's just one story. They've done this in a number of ways. They've created mechanisms that connect the multinational corporations to local firms for R&D upgrading. They've connected the government and firms to research and development. One great example of this was Seagate, where again they paid to train the engineers. Seagate then moved one of its R&D facilities there, and then the government also created options to move that technology out of the R&D center and into a research center at the bottom here, where they connected with the National University of Singapore to do basic research on 13 different areas, but one of those was data storage. And they have a number of advanced materials handling and all kinds of different areas in which they're focused on. I should say here, this is not industrial planning like happened earlier in East Asia. This is really about picking broad areas and then letting champions emerge. There's no nurturing going on here like there was in these other developmental state economies. So very much the state is coordinating this, but it's getting the market to participate, and it's bringing them to the fore, the leadership in making these things happen. Thailand and Malaysia, on the other hand, have not gone down this same coordinating type of path, and so they've really followed the Washington Consensus liberal open market economy. But what this has done is really positioned them and caught them in a structural squeeze in which they're neither price competitive on the labor with China, nor intellectually or technologically competitive with Singapore or the developed countries, which puts them in a very tough situation. And it's resulted in some very strange policies, in some cases trying to suppress labor, in some cases trying to force technological development. But as we all know, that innovation and technological development is a very creative process and one that is very difficult to force from a top-down position. This has led to a backlash to globalization in some of these countries. Thailand, for example, the king has come out and put forth this idea of sufficiency economics. It's very ill-defined. It's very difficult to understand how you get sufficiency economics without some level of protection. And so there's some real conflicts here in some of these countries about how to move forward. One of the big interesting things for me is how do some of the things that we learn in these small developing countries maybe apply to the United States? I don't think there's very many lessons we can take on a national level, but I think on a state level there's a lot to learn. I'm from Michigan, and right now Michigan has the highest unemployment in the country. It has a declining automobile manufacturing sector and a very difficult transition process in our state from moving out of second and third stage manufacturing to more third and fourth stage upgrading technological and knowledge-based industries. The problem here, though, obviously, is Singapore has a very strong state. It has an ability to coordinate. We have, in turn, very high levels of fragmentation. This leads to very murky vision and entrenched institutions and cultures that are difficult to overturn without some sort of top-down coordination. But even saying that top-down coordination, it's very important to understand that really the implementation comes from this private sector, from academia, and from labor. Just to point out, labor's role in Singapore is very different than it is here. Rather than collectively bargain for wage increases, very early on it was clear that any wage increase labor got would come from productivity increases. So what happened is the government gave labor the responsibility to improve skills. So labor's focus is on skills improvement because that's where the productivity upgrading happens, and that's where the wage increases happen. So at that point, I think that there are things that we might think about, ways to create this vision and this focus, ways to change institutions, and I think that the political structure is going to have to be a key component of that as well, and maybe that leads the teacher to be the student at that point. Thanks.
Thank you all. We have several questions here that tend to touch on the same topic, and that is, I'll read this one because it seems to mostly focus the point. Carl Dahlman brought up the point that the tension between the interests of multinationals in China and other developing countries in the United States, the tension between the interests of those companies in China and in the U.S. national interest. What kinds of things do you think the U.S. could do to more closely align corporate interests with the national interests of the United States? I would add to that, what do these other countries we've been talking about do to align multinational interests with their goals? All of you?
Okay, let me start. The reason why I mention that is because the multinational is the biggest agent in generating applied knowledge. Over 50% of all the R&D done globally is by the multinational. And they are operating globally and trying to maximize profits. They want to apply it over the biggest possible scale. Knowledge is not consumed in its use. And they're going to wherever there are the best opportunities, where the good assets and the good markets. And so they are looking at a globally integrated company. And you can read the article by Sam Palmistrano in the Foreign Affairs in June. I think it explains that very clearly. Now, the problem is that when you have a more globalized economy and you have very different assets placed in different places, this is a tension then in what they're looking for, which is perfectly reasonable from their point of view, and the objective of each nation state, where you get down to employment. And what's happening right now, lots of things are being outsourced from the U.S., offshored in manufacturing to places all over the world, and China is receiving a lot. And not just now what the manufacturing jobs, but the service jobs that can be done digitally. And so the company is going to wherever sees the best thing, and it's also putting in place lots of R&D. For example, 800 R&D institutes in China, there's 200 in India. And this is part of this fragmentation of the different tasks. But from the point of view of the domestic economies, then you have a lot of labor which is not being hired, and the question then is, where are they going to be hired? Are you going to have these opportunities? Now, it's very hard to have any simple solution to this. I'm just pointing out this tension. I mean, the multinational is the most important agent in generating wealth and distributing it. And so you do have this inherent thing. Now, what I think can be done is a lot of policies to do in terms of the retraining the workers, taking the load off some of the pension costs, the Social Security, and those are the national policies that have to be done more broadly in the case of the U.S. to continue to make it attractive to hire labor in the U.S. and to be able to have them in the kind of skills which are necessary. So I think it's basically that, plus of course the broader things on the fiscal policy and the government budget.
In the case of India, again for the first 30 years or 35 years, there's complete distrust of multinationals, viewed as exploiters and so on. It was not at all welcoming of multinationals establishing enterprises within India. This has all changed, but it has been selective. In the case of information technology, ITES services sector, the welcome mat is very welcome, and indeed now many the enterprises from outside have not only established earlier on the low-end information technology the activities, now high-end research and the development and also engineering services. These are being India is becoming a destination for multinational enterprises. But this doesn't go across the sectors. One area where it could make a difference is about in the other services sector, retail trade, for example. India has been extremely reluctant in opening retail trade for foreign investment. It's still now what has happened is they want to encourage domestic large enterprises to establish their own retail, domestic firms to establish retail chains. And then once there is a domestic competitive capacity to face up to the multinational firms, they are sequencing the entry of into the retail trade. That's one area. Financial sector, again, some reluctance to expand the presence of foreign banks and foreign enterprises. This is very much the case to keep the financial system as much as possible in the hands of domestic ownership. The industrial sector, once again, now India is opening up, like China, in the manufacturing area, auto components, auto sectors, telecommunications area. Number of multinationals have come in and established facilities. Here again, this is a Indian policy has been selective. I don't know whether they have the capability, and I doubt whether any government has the capability to look far into the future and pick winners, but at least they believe they can pick winners and they're being selected.
Again, I think that Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore, these smaller Southeast Asian countries, are in a different position than these larger countries. They've always had the welcome mat out for multinational corporations, but they're still trying to protect their local industries in banking and telecommunications and other things like that as well. And I think that they put a lot of stock into the idea that if these foreign multinationals came, especially in Malaysia and Thailand, the technology would naturally transfer into society. And when that hasn't happened, there's a lot of skepticism about their value, and there's this pushback now against some of this. And Singapore took this active approach and has been fairly successful. These other countries have not. And so, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out going forward. But that's certainly a difference. And they don't have a market. These multinational companies don't make Thai products the way they make Chinese products or Indian products or other things like that. So, there's not that same sort of incentive for the companies to share technology.
A couple of questions here that I'm going to try to combine into perhaps one. One focuses on the decline in rural poverty, particularly in China, from 30.7% in '78 to 9.5% in 1990. The questioner asks, what is that directly related to? Is that decrease attributable to the opening of China and economic growth? I would marry that with a second question that relates to what several of you mentioned, was the potential for a rise in inequality, rise in income inequality. Are we going to see political tensions, economic tensions developing? Is this decline in poverty going to change?
Okay, on this issue in China, basically what the process was as China began to open up to the rest of the world, setting up special export processing zones, increasing their number, and eventually joining WTO, integrating into the global economy, pulled a lot of people out of the rural areas to the coastal areas. And you had one of the biggest migrations in history. Maybe 200 to 300 million people have moved from the countryside to the coastal provinces to work in this export-oriented manufacturing. And this is what has raised the per capita incomes and reduced the poverty rates. And this kind of transformation has not happened in India because you haven't had this big integration. In India, it's been very limited to just a few little tiny islands based on the ICT sector, as Tian pointed out. So that's a very big difference. Now, Income inequality is increasing very rapidly in China. The Gini coefficient in 1990 was about 0.33, now it's about 0.47. So China has become more unequal than the US in the space of 15 years, and the projections, if this were to continue, it becomes more unequal. And this is a potentially destabilizing situation because there's tremendous TV penetration in the countryside. People in the countryside can see what is happening. People are becoming billionaires almost overnight with special relationships with government and with foreigners. And so even though the income in the poorer parts has been going up slowly, 1 to 2, 3%, the cost of bounces grow at 15 to 20%, you see relative deprivation. And that is one of the big concerns that the government has. That was, of course, the political transition.
In India, agriculture was not at all the focus of the reforms in 1991. The opening of agriculture to international trade is still relatively limited, and India's stance in the WTO Doha round also is not exactly one of greater opening into of the Indian agriculture. So to that extent, you don't expect, if there is no reform, if there is no the opening, you don't expect much of an impact on rural areas and rural poverty. And you see it in the data. There is a reduction in rural poverty, has not been that extensive. But that said, there is also a concern that across, just as in China, coastal regions growing much faster, and drawing labor from the rural areas. India also, there is a substantial regional disparities in growth, but as Carl pointed out, India is not really a single common market, and there are many internal barriers. And so the kind of movement of drawing labor from agriculture and rural areas into fast-growing towns and fast-growing states has not happened to the same extent in India. But my view of inequality is somewhat different from Carl's, in the sense that it is natural that when you open up an economy, you create opportunities, and not everybody, not every region, not every household, not every town is equally placed when you begin the opening to take advantage of the opening. And so it is absolutely natural that the disparities widen initially. If they didn't, in my view, your reform has not succeeded. So the question to be asked is not that widening of disparities, whether there are processes that will make those who were initially not in a position to take advantage of it or enable to catch up. So that's the question that one should ask, not about increases in inequality. India being a democracy, there is the electoral competition, and the people provide, there are signals that this is not where you should be going, this is where you should be going. That's happening in the Indian case. Far more attention is being paid now to agriculture and rural areas. And so, but China, I don't know. China is not a democracy. Who knows what will happen? But in India, at least, there is a safety valve of democracy which will correct extremes developing.
Well, inequality is certainly a problem in these smaller countries as well, and they've been doing this FDI longer, and there doesn't seem to be any convergence back toward equality in these countries. In fact, Thailand had the highest per capita ownership of Mercedes-Benz in the world until 1987. So there's certainly these problems. Although how destabilizing, Thailand is also a democracy. Although when things look like the government gets a little too strong, then the king says, all right, let's have a coup, and we'll just remove them that way, and then we'll go back to democracy. So, instability, it's hard to say whether that's just a rearranging of the deck chairs or whether there's something deeper going on there, but this is certainly a problem.
Contrarian question, does the rise in inequality help the U.S. efforts to sell to these emerging economies?
Very quickly, it does. I mean, take a look at China. Because of the very unequal income distribution now, if you look at China in terms of purchasing power parity terms, per capita income is about $5,000. If you take the top 10% of the population, the per capita income is $18,000. That is a very significant market, and that's 130 million people. If you go down to 20%, you're talking about 260 million people, and it's about 12,000.
So for U.S. export terms, maybe we ought to be
And
welcoming a little
that is why the auto industry is going gangbusters in China, 70% growth per year. People want access to this. There is the income. You have this growing class that has the income to do it. So it's a very, very lucrative market. Now, it creates other problems in terms of some of the side effects, pollution in the case of the auto industry, which are different.
The same thing is true in India, once again, that the emergence of so-called rising middle class of various estimates from 250 million to 150 million. This creates a market, huge market for products that US and other developed countries produce. But much more in the case of India than perhaps in China, the US culture. There are, whether it is good or bad, I leave it to others to decide. But that the US culture is influencing the choices that individuals in this particular group, upper income groups, make. And whether it is good for them or good for the economy, I don't know.
Here's a definite economist question. Do you think that revealed comparative advantage, a method used by economists to determine competitiveness by calculating a country's exports of a specific category as a percent in trade of all products, is a good benchmark to determine where the United States should specialize relative to trade with China? I suppose that could apply as well to the smaller countries in Southeast Asia.
Let me take a crack. It's a start, but it's a very imperfect measure because, for example, if you take a look in terms of the revealed comparative advantage, it depends also on the input-output matrices having to do with the different sectors. So, for example, one of the things you look at now, if you look at in a figure cited in terms of the high-tech exports from many of these East Asian countries, they do it, but that's because they're importing all the components, assembling them, so the real technology value there is very low. So you have to be careful when you look at the figures. But I think that it does give you a good understanding of where there is a broad-based capability, and it gives you a sense of where you might build on that. And I think you might think of particular cluster policies, see how you can strengthen the key factors that are necessary to move that forward, including the links to R&D and education, and of course also very importantly, creativity. And that's back to the question on entrepreneurship and creativity.
I'm not a great fan of revealed comparative advantage devised by my late friend Bala Balasa. It's a backward-looking notion. It's not a forward-looking notion where your comparative advantage is likely to lie in the future. It has nothing to say. It only tells you what it is that you have done in the past, good, bad, or indifferent, that has resulted in the particular trade pattern that you observe. And so I'm not at all sure you can learn anything useful by looking at the static notion of revealed comparative advantage.
That's fine. Two questions here that sort of touch on similar ideas. We talked a little bit about how we can't predict exactly where these countries are going. We mentioned corruption as being significant problems in China and in India. Is it going to get worse? What's the macro effect going to be? And what about the sort of other overhanging geopolitical problem, terrorism? Is that going to be a problem in these countries?
In India, terrorism is a problem. India, terrorism has been a problem long before 9/11, and when U.S. woke up to terrorism too late, India has been facing it for decades before, and that is a problem, and that is an increasing concern. Whether Indian assessment that it is large part of it originates from its neighbor, and if the relations with its neighbor Pakistan improves, whether things are going to change for the better, it remains to be seen. As we talk now, the foreign secretaries of India and Pakistan have been meeting with each other to push the dialogue further, but I don't know. That is a major concern for India.
On the corruption issue, it is clear that there's corruption in both countries, and that is a problem that sometimes gets more and more attention and visibility and gets out of hand. If you look at China historically, going back several thousand years, there are periods where, you know, the rulers become very greedy and start to use things for their own good, and then the people revolt. And in the case of a one-party system, which you have right now, they have to be very careful, because if there's a very widespread perception of the corruption, there will be a lot of popular discontent, which is why they do periodic cleanups, and the penalty is death, and they have executed even governors. So that's part of what you have in a central system. On the terrorism, it hasn't been such a big problem in China, because there's more control, and there's very strong control of the internet, and that goes back to the issue of the inequality and instability. China, in reforming and privatizing state-owned enterprises, has been firing at the rate of 10 to 15 million workers per year in the state-owned enterprises. These are organized urban workers. You can imagine that if they're unhappy, that could be very destabilizing, which is why they worry so much about, on the internet, they use it very much, they understand to reduce transactions, cost for economic activities, all that is great. Any political association of bringing together that might threaten the continuity of the one-party system, of course, is immediately clamped down, and that's the system.
I'll just say a couple things really quickly. I think that in terms of corruption, all of these countries are corrupt. The problem I have with corruption is that it's very difficult to know exactly what its influence is. Certainly, I think we'd all agree that the less corruption there is, the better. But look at Korea, Taiwan, Japan. These are countries that were very corrupt as they grew. So part of the question is what kind of corruption, where is it, how is it operating, those types of things. As far as terrorism in Southeast Asia, I think it's actually remarkable how little there is. You know, if you think about Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, and Malaysia is also a large Muslim country, to have so little terrorism there is quite remarkable, especially since there isn't this strong state control in that sense. But
if I could just add one thing on the whole issue of corruption. One of the things you have to understand about China is that the whole incentive regime of this one-party system is based on performance of the local authorities, municipal, provincial, and central, in terms of employment and growth. And so that is what drives the efficiency of the system. So, and that leads to some kind of accountability, and people are rotated, and so given that standard, whereas in many other places, including in very democratic places, there is not this focus on the accountability in terms of performance, and that makes a big difference.
There's one question that no one seemed to ask, and I'm going to ask it myself, and that is, I don't see a single lawmaker in this room today, which is not a terrible surprise, but it seems to me that the folks several blocks away from here don't have a great appreciation for the specific problems in China, maybe in India, maybe in Southeast Asia. We've got a Vietnam trade pact that went down the other day. We've got trouble with the India nuclear pact. There's Chuck Schumer and Lindsey Graham are still pushing their punitive tariff for currencies. How bad is the misunderstanding on Capitol Hill, and what can be done about that? Maybe that should be the topic of the conference.
Long ago, Paul Samuelson was asked a question by Stanislav Ulam, a mathematician who had worked on Manhattan Project. Like any mathematician, arrogant mathematician, he challenged Paul Samuelson, name one proposition in all of social sciences which is true and non-trivial. And Paul Samuelson replied, comparative advantage. And this was initiated 2 centuries ago or so. Chuck Schumer hasn't understood it even now. So I don't know. I don't know whether the Congress knowledge about comparative advantage has advanced at all, and that is where the problem lies, it seems to me.
Maybe that's the last word.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, panel. That was another terrific session that was thought-provoking. Lots of food for thought. I now have the enormous pleasure of introducing and welcoming to the Woodrow Wilson Center former Secretary of Commerce Peter Peterson. Just 3 weeks ago, the Wilson Center celebrated the 150th birthday of our namesake, Woodrow Wilson. In part, we recognized his enormous accomplishments as an academic, as a university president, and as a national and world leader. In many ways, Pete Peterson fits the Wilsonian mold, with multiple accomplishments to his name. Time magazine, just as for instance, has recognized him as the most powerful and influential Secretary of Commerce in history. His Blackstone Group has emerged as an enormously successful investment house. In the early 1980s, he was the founding chairman of the Institute for International Economics, a Washington-based think tank that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The Institute has recently been renamed the Peterson Institute for International Economics in recognition for Pete's long-standing leadership and support. In the world of foreign policy, he's played a similar leadership and supporting role for the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, Wilson-like, he has taken on the ambitious role of focusing the attention of the United States on the financial challenges that we are facing as a nation today and that will only grow over time. He's authored 2 recent compelling books. I recommend both of them to you. In Gray Dawn, the first of those 2, he points to the growing tension between social promises for health care, pensions, and so forth, and the demographic impact of the soon-to-be retiring baby boom generation. In Running on Empty, his more recent book, he keeps his emphasis on the interaction of entitlement programs and shifting demographics, while also warning us about the looming burden of foreign debt, record current account, and trade deficits. Anyone, all of you, please, if you're concerned about the economic future of the country, you want to read these 2 books. Again, let me say how delighted, Mr. Secretary, we are to have you here at the Wilson Center. Please, the podium is yours.
How kind of you to mention several things. As far as the naming of the Institute for International Economics, before I take it too seriously, I'm reminded of what Ben Sonnenberg said when he was asked what was his job as he saw it. He said he saw his job as building big pedestals for little men. As far as my books are concerned, I don't know how many of you are here in business, but if you are, I want to warn you in advance that if you're pretentious enough to write books as a businessman, you have to be prepared for a lot of roasting by the intelligentsia. In my case, Ted Sorensen is my favorite roaster. About Gray Dawn, he says, Gray Dawn is a